welcome everybody, and thank you so much. We've already touched cross century at 6 o'clock, 1 minute past 6. It's great to see all of you here on a Saturday evening, and a very special thanks to our faculty, to all our wonderful faculty who are here, and mainly the Secretary of AOC and Dr. Anaita and Dr. Maya Thomas, our moderators. Dr. Anaita doesn't need any introduction. Both of them don't need introduction. Dr. Anaita is the president of the AOCN, as well as now a part of ICNA as well. Dr. Anaita is one of the leading pediatric neurologists in the country, based in Mumbai, with multiple. I don't even want to go to all her affiliations. There's far too many to say. And Dr. Maya Thomas is a pioneering pediatric neurologist based in CMC Vellore, started a lot of programs there. So I'm leaving the session on to both of you. And thank you to ORDI, Organization for Rare Diseases India, which has created this platform. It's a parent support umbrella organization, which has managed to bring many specialists together so that we can share knowledge today. And hopefully this will help improve patient care. On to both of you.
So good evening. Before I request Maya to introduce the first speaker and we start, just a little housekeeping notes that we will be sticking to time, 3 speakers, one after the other. And please put your questions into the chat box so that we are able to ask and see that all of your concerns are addressed at the end of the program. Just to thank ORDI for hosting this fantastic webinar series. The biggest thanks, I think, goes to Anne. And with that, Maya, I think we can start. And if you could introduce the first speaker.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome everyone to the 4th session, which is on mitochondrial disorders. We have a galaxy of speakers, and mitochondrial disorders are, it's very common. And when we know that when something is not going on with a child, we tend to kind of basket them into mitochondrial cytopathies. So at the end of the session, we hope we will be enlightened a bit more. And I have the pleasure of introducing the first speaker, Dr. Sunita Vijarnya Mahe. Dr. Anne, Dr. Sunita, would you like to put up your introductory slide?
Yes, ma'am.
So Dr. Sunita is Senior Consultant and Professor, Institute of Medical Genetics and Genomics at Sir Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi. And her area of special interest is in the inborn errors of metabolism. And she has several publications. Her current research includes genetic etiologies in childhood neuroregressions, LSDs, and genetically determined leukodystrophies and mitochondriopathies. Without wasting any more time, I would like to hand over to Dr. Sunita.
Thank you very much, Dr. Thomas and Dr. Hegde, for such a nice introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and I also thank AOCN and ORDI for the opportunity. So the talk assigned to me is clinical clues in mitochondrial disorders. So we just start straight away by introducing the mitochondria, which is really the powerhouse of the cell. So all of us actually thrive on these mitochondria because it gives up to 90% of the energy that we need for our day-to-day lives. So mitochondrial disorders stem up from anything going wrong with these mitochondrial functions. The overall, since there's a heterogeneous group, lots of disorders come into this group. A combined incidence of these disorders is quite high, more than 1 in 5,000. So the journey really started in the 60s when Dr. Lutf first reported a disorder of the mitochondrial origin. Then it led to discovery of the mitochondrial DNA in 1981, followed by nuclear genes, which are positive for these disorders. So we are now continuously expanding our spectrum. And I don't know what the real number of genes discovered is. Maybe Dr. Raman can throw some light on it. But this was only up to 2020, where there were close to 350 genes that were known. And of note, we know that majority of the genes reside in the nucleus rather than the mitochondria itself. a little difference between adults and children who have mitochondrial disorders. Whereas in adults, we see more well-defined syndromes which have been previously characterized, and more than 40% of these disorders are due to any mutations in the mitochondrial DNA itself, and which is why that they follow the maternal inheritance pattern. In children, it's quite the opposite. We see all kinds of disorders, as I will be alluding to, and majority of these disorders have an underlying basis in the genes which are encoded by the nucleus, and thus they follow the Mendelian patterns of inheritance rather than the mitochondria. So we all know this beautiful structure of mitochondria, and we also know that this being a predominantly pediatric neurology group, I don't need to tell anything about the brain and the skeletal muscle, the neurological aspect. But of course, this is also to let you know that mitochondria have function all over the body, so multiple organ systems are involved. So let's get down to business. I've been assigned to tell you about the clinical clues. And I thought that the best way to describe is to go through examples or cases. So just a little introductory slide. We all know that mitochondrial disorders can present at any age, any system, any degree of severity. So actually there are no rules for mitochondria. Of course, brain having the highest basal metabolic rate is the most common organ system involved, with a host of manifestations which we will be tackling now. But other than that, the second most common organ systems are like the liver, the muscle, the kidney, the heart, and so on. So when we see a certain clustering of symptoms, we can make a disorder and we can put them all together into a syndromic diagnosis. And that's how historically all these disorders have come around. So we have disorders like Lee syndrome, Murph, Melas, Lawn, NARP, PEO, Pearson-Marrow, and Alport syndrome. So how we tend to recognize mitochondrial disorders is one, of course, through clustering these symptoms. Then to analyze our pedigrees, like how many people in the family affected, how are they connected to each other, what's the pattern of inheritance. And then, of course, there are certain typical signs sometimes you see, such as valproate-induced liver failure, which is quite characteristic of mitochondrial disorders. And of course, triggers which induce stress in the body, such as the fever, trauma, etc. So I'd like to introduce this very beautiful slide, and I call it Dr. Morris's, because he's the one who introduced this concept here. So if we look at the time course of patients who have Lee syndrome, typical mitochondrial disease, so a normal healthy child would follow in the due course of life and would learn some skills or would develop in a certain way. So that's the normal trajectory. But in patients who have a mitochondrial disorder, they tend to dissuade from this line. And of course, there are intermittent pauses. But the child tries to come back into the line, but then falls back with another episode, and that's how. So the child never tends to come back to the baseline. So this is how a typical mitochondrial Lee syndrome patients behave in their course of disease. I'm stuck now. I'm just trying to get to the next slide. Okay, so I would like to tell you, get back to the red flags. There are very many signs or clinical clues that we can take in order to get to our diagnosis of mitochondrial. And I've just tried to list like the top 10 or so of them. So majority of them are neurological, as you know, encephalopathy, seizures, neuromuscular weakness, neuroregression with or without white matter diseases, then eye signs such as progressive external ophthalmoplegia or sometimes retinitis pigmentosa, or even cataracts, deafness, etc. Then coming on to non-neurological, well, metabolic acidosis can be put into both. Then cardiac, such as cardiomyopathies, especially the hypertrophic cardiomyopathies. Certain hepatopathies may or may not be leading to acute liver failure, renal involvement in form of renal tubular acidosis, then certain endocrine manifestations, and so on. So there are lots of other symptoms which is really difficult to put in one. So we'll get going with this cases. So this was a 14-year-old boy who presented with painless progressive diminution of vision sequentially from one eye to the other in the span of a year. So he had headaches episodically. He got an eye exam done where the fundus showed bilateral optic atrophy. The ophthalmologist and the referred to neurologist who also did MRI brain, which was normal. The blood lactates were also normal. So in view of the family pedigree, there were two more male relatives that were affected with similar disorder, and they were all connected through their female relatives. So this actually fit into the pattern of mitochondrial inheritance or maternal inheritance. And because of the inheritance pattern and the typical presentation of painless diminution of vision, with optic atrophy, a diagnosis of LHON was made, and which was then proven by genetic testing, which showed the most common mutation in the mitochondrial DNA. So this is a very typical case. So prior to the NDS era, there were lots of clinical diagnostic criteria that had been put forth by clinicians and which were used to quite a degree of accuracy. But now we don't use them that much. We have all heard of like the Nijmegen criteria. This was another Bernier criteria in 2002. Majority of these criteria utilize the clinical aspects along with the histopathology aspects, where you see patterns of the mitochondrial involvement as well as enzymology. So it's tedious to do enzymology, whereas in India it's very difficult to get one done. So we are no longer able to use these criteria. Instead, it's very convenient for us to go ahead and do molecular testing. So I have just put this slide to let you know that there are very many recognizable syndromes. I don't think I need to go through it. There's a very good overview in Gene Reviews for it, and one could read it and find out. So the disorders such as Alpers, CPO, KSS, and then NARF, MELAS, they're all there, and they're with the primary features as well as some additional manifestations. We can see LON as well. Now, coming back to another case, this was a 3-year-old boy born out of consanguineous marriage, and I'm sorry, this was a healthy sibling. So presented with global developmental delay. He had motor delay in the form of delay in neck holding, even walking. He could start walking at 2.5, but he was still unsteady. There was speech delay as well, and the speech was also somewhat slurred. So then when he turned 3 years, suddenly on a day, he started having seizures, and which led to, one thing led to the other. He was hospitalized. He was in some form of encephalopathy for a bit. And post that, he regressed all his milestones. He started showing abnormal movements in form of dystonia. He was very irritable. He also developed swallowing difficulty, and he had to go through a very stormy course. But he improved, and in a few months' time, when he came to us for an evaluation, he had already started to regain some of his milestones. So this was a child, and on investigations, in view of the history of this regression and a previously global developmental delay child, certain tests were done, which were both routine as well as metabolic and specific. So really, there was no clue here. Here, even the lactates were normal. His CSF studies were done, which were also normal. The EEG was, of course, showing fast beta activity. It was just one urine GCMS organic acids which showed non-specific abnormalities. There was elevation of lactate and some TCA metabolites. But it was really the MRI of the brain which showed abnormality. So the MRI showed, I only have this picture here, it showed asymmetrical, almost symmetrical pattern of involvement of bilateral basal ganglia. This is the TRIM image, which shows diffuse involvement of the entire basal ganglia along with a little bit of cystic degeneration indicating necrosis. There's also a bit of involvement of the periventricular white matter, and also the other areas like the brainstem is also involved here. So all this pattern of involvement led us to think about a disorder, mitochondriopathy. So just to put it in summary, a child with global development delay with onset of seizures followed by ataxia, born to consanguineous parents with a little bit of findings on metabolic testing, but with a very specific MRI findings suggestive of Lee syndrome. So we went ahead and performed a whole exome sequencing, and lo and behold, we did get a diagnosis. There was a homozygous pathogenic variant in a gene which causes Lee syndrome. It impacts on the mitochondrial respiratory chain complex 3. So Lee syndrome is really a prototype of mitochondrial disorders. It is both clinical radiological evidence of brainstem and of basal ganglia involvement, followed by the clinical subacute course, leading to psychomotor regression, along with a supporting role of the abnormal energy metabolism, evidence that is supported by an elevated lactate or the defects in the enzymology or molecular diagnosis of the same. So another case, a similar 3-year-old boy who really presented with, was all right till 6 months, after which he had progressive failure to thrive, poor feeding. He also had developmental stagnation. And when he came to us, he also showed a bit of nystagmus. So his primary investigations did not really show much. We also suspected cystic fibrosis, but that was not to be. He did not have celiac disease. The GCMS again showed very non-specific lactate. So here as well, his MRI gave us a clue. The clinical clue got on the MRI were a bilaterally symmetrical involvement of the basal ganglia as well as the periventricular and deep white matter, the brain stem involvement, a little bit of cerebellar involvement as well. So all these features were very suggestive of Lee syndrome, and we did get a diagnosis of Lee syndrome through genetic testing. This was in fact one of the common genes that is involved in Lee syndrome, the SIRF1. So from gene reviews, one could say that these are the common features of SIRF1 related Lee syndrome, and we all had that. In another case, this was only about a 6-month-old baby who presented with history of fever following a DPT vaccination and then leading to loss of milestones. He had lethargy, tremulousness, and even through a seizure. On his MRI, there were bilaterally symmetrical, extensive white matter abnormalities, so to say leukoencephalopathy. And this was quite characteristic of a mitochondrial disorder. Along with the history of neuroregression, we could put together everything and say that this is likely to be a mitochondrial disorder. Of course, the genetic testing was to be done too. In this particular case, we did not go for whole exome. Rather, we went ahead and did a targeted NDU-FV1 gene sequencing, because we had this prior knowledge that there are certain common mutations in this NDU-FV1 gene, and the child did show a heterozygous, this same common variant was present in heterozygous form as well. So these are 3-4 cases are those of Lee syndrome. Then we come to another neurological presentation, an 11-year-old male born out of non-consanguineous marriage, presented with sudden loss of vision in an acute febrile illness. He went on to have encephalopathy and seizures as well. He did improve in a few days' time, and this was his MRI at the time, which showed asymmetrical involvement with, one could say, a stroke-like pattern, but not really following any vascular territory. So after improvement, he did show many more episodes, and he's about 20 years now. So in the last 9 or 10 years, he's had more than 10 episodes. He has progressed in his illness. There is progressive hearing impairment. There are psychiatric issues with the boy. He's very short in stature. He has significant feeding difficulties. And in the family, his own sister is suffering from migraine. And so mother also has some kind of migraine. So all these features with a stroke-like episode, one could guess the diagnosis. It was MELAS. So mitochondrial encephalomyopathy with lactic acidosis and stroke-like episodes. We did a targeted testing for this boy, and he did have this most common mutation in the MTTL mitochondrial gene, the 3243A2G variant. Of course, this is not present in all individuals. Rarely, there are other genes also involved causing the similar phenotype. Now, this is all that I could say about the neurological presentation. I'm sure it doesn't end there, but we'll have to move on. So in another case, this was a consanguineous family who presented to us from Afghanistan, having lost very many children, and with this 2.5-month-old boy. Of course, there was some disparity in the presentation, and it appeared as if there were two disorders. Two children died of what you say immunodeficiency, and the other two did not have that. This particular, the proband, was 2.5 months. He had recurrent episodes of respiratory distress. So starting the neonatal period, there was severe metabolic acidosis and the lactates were high. There was no evidence of sepsis. In his urine GCMS, we could see a huge peak of lactate, but there were no other real metabolites here. So to say, there were no real ketosis or ketonuria evident. The other metabolic tests were normal. So on examination, he did have a little bit of failure to thrive. There was tachypnea, the liver was enlarged, and so were his lactate. This is just one of the readings. There were multiple lactates going up to 8 or 9 as well. So a diagnosis of primary lactic acidemia was made in this boy, which could be secondary to pyruvate dehydrogenase or carboxylase or even a mitochondrial respiratory chain disorder. So we got the diagnosis from the whole exome sequencing. He did have So he did have a pyruvate dehydrogenase deficiency, the autosomal recessive type. There was homozygous pathogenic variant here. And this is the beauty of whole exome sequencing. We also got the answer to what his sibling might have died of. And this was really this, the second mutation. And this was in this gene, which causes a severe combined immunodeficiency. And this little boy was only a carrier for that. So in the family, the second boy who had immunodeficiency actually even underwent a bone marrow transplant because of the SCID, but could not survive. So the whole exome sequencing managed to give us 2 diagnoses in the family. So now we have learned about metabolic acidosis as another clinical clue. Then moving on, this was a 10-month-old boy born of non-consanguineous parents from Bihar. He presented with history of failure to gain weight since 6 months of age. Till 6 months, he was fine, but after that, he didn't gain any weight. And he also regressed a bit in his milestone. He had started to sit, and which he was no longer doing. He was no longer turning over, and he had lost a little bit of weight. He had hypotonia and head lag. The DTRs were present. So it was a bit of a puzzle. His X-ray of the chest showed cardiomegaly. Of course, he was referred to us by a cardiologist. So there was an echocardiography in hand. There was hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. There was concentric LVH with asymmetrical septal hypertrophy as well, which is non-obstructive. So in the blood test, we found a significant elevation of lactate. Here, the value should go only up to 20 in terms of milligram per deciliter. So here we have a boy who had cardiomyopathy and failure to thrive with elevated lactates. So what did we get on a whole exome? We did get a mutation, a homozygous mutation in a gene, GTPPP3, which causes combined oxidative phosphorylation deficiency with cardiomyopathy as its predominant phenotype. So this is how exomes are actually giving us the diagnosis. So we must never forget cardiac manifestations in children who have mitochondrial disorder. Now, this is piggybacking on the other child because this is another condition where there is cardiomyopathy, except that in this boy, there was no cardiomyopathy. So we know that there are certain exceptions to the rule as well. Now, this little boy born to consanguineous parents was only 5 months old when parents noted bilateral cataracts. There was global developmental delay by the time he came to us, about a year old. He had failure to thrive. He had brisk reflexes, and on metabolic testing, which he already had in hand, there were elevation of alanine on the plasma amino acids, as well as lactate and TCA metabolite, as well as some ketones in the urine. The blood lactate was significantly elevated. There was a family history of a previous child being affected similarly who died at 1.5 years of age. So this boy was diagnosed with AGK gene deficiency involvement. There was another exception in a consanguineous family. We get 2 compound heterozygous variants. That also happens. So this child had Senger syndrome. As in Senger syndrome, cardiomyopathy does feature predominantly, except that this boy did not have. Moving on, so we have now learned about cataract, and moving on. This 8-month-old boy born to consanguineous parents, again from Afghanistan, had presented with mild motor delay and some abdominal distension, gradual onset since 4 months of age, along with some liver dysfunction. But he presented catastrophically with acute onset of lethargy, worsening jaundice. By the time he was shifted to a hospital here, he was an encephalopathy and had seizure. So basically, he was diagnosed to have an acute permanent liver failure. In this case as well, there was a previous history of sibling dying at 1.5 years of age with a similar illness. The child also had a liver disease. So here we have a child on investigations. There were so the lactates were severely elevated. There was liver dysfunction, and there was a lot of ammonias were normal, and so in this child there was a lot of features to suggest a mitochondrial respiratory involvement. In this particular child, we managed to get the electron transport chain enzymology and noted a deficiency, severe deficiency of complex 1 and 3 with a normal complex 4. And so this child presented with acute liver failure. This is another manifestation of mitochondriopathy. Moving on, another 10-month-old female child presented to us with failure to gain weight, recurrent episodes of dehydration, and motor delay. There had been a similar history in the past. The child, when at 5 months of age, had 1 episode of a upper respiratory infection, at which time she had dehydration as well and was noted to have metabolic acidosis. And these episodes repeated 4 to 5 times in the last 5 months. And by the time when the child presented, she had failure to thrive as well. There was also a history of hearing impairment in this child. On examination, one prominent feature was a hypertension in this girl, with myopathic facies and elicitable deep tendon reflexes and hypotonia. There was no organomegaly. So on her examination, the prominent points were metabolic acidosis. There was involvement of the kidneys here with potassium going high and with raised aldosterone, and the ultrasound showing a medical renal disease as well. So there were quite high elevation of lactates, and the urine GCMS was also showing some abnormalities. So basically, in this child, in view of the multi-system involvement and some clues in our initial testing, we were suspecting a mitochondrial disease, which we were able to prove on whole exome sequencing. So this little girl had involvement of RMND1 gene, which predominantly causes a combined oxidative phosphorylation, and this also a renal tubular acidosis is the predominant feature here. So now we have also learned that renal tubular acidosis can be a good clinical clue. This is the last case. So this 19-month-old girl presented with history only of 10 days with fever, cough, followed by respiratory distress. She did have some abnormal reports with hypoglycemia, mild metabolic acidosis with elevated lactates. So after being managed somewhere outside, she came to our hospital, got admitted. And in the past history there, the parents noted that she was actually showing poor weight gain and was not eating much in the last few months. On examination, apart from the dehydration and the irritability, we could also note some hyperpigmentation, especially around the lips. So in view of the acidosis and everything, we did suspect adrenal involvement, and she was investigated on those lines. There was acidosis, and there was, so adrenal insufficiency was proven, and she received a hydrocortisone treatment. And these are the investigations which showed sky-high elevated lactate with low bicarbonate and lower than expected cortisol in the kind of stress that she was in. Her urine GCMS again showed elevation of lactate. Now in this little girl who was only 1.5 years old, the whole exome, the clinical exome sequence did not give us the diagnosis. In fact, it did give us her carrier status for Wilson because one of her uncles had a Wilson disease. So she was only a carrier and not having the disease. So we went ahead and did the MLPA for mitochondrial deletions in this because there's rare presentation of adrenal insufficiency in such cases. And we did find a 50% reduction in the dosage of mitochondrial DNA, which covers the typical portion of the mitochondrial DNA. So thus there was heteroplasmic deletion of the mitochondrial DNA involving the MTCO1 to MTCO3 gene, which are really the complex 4 genes, thus giving us the diagnosis of adrenal insufficiency due to mitochondrial DNA deletions. So this is again one not very common, uncommon presentation of mitochondrial disease. And this also gives us a clue that even in younger children, one could have mitochondrial DNA involvement. So just to conclude, we know mitochondrial disorders are common. One should have the index of suspicion. They're increasingly becoming easy and accessible to recognize, and we have the NGS now. There are clinical clues which are very helpful in narrowing down the diagnosis. We must start thinking of nuclear encoded mitochondrial disorders, especially in the very young children. And even if we don't have a diagnosis in the first go, we should keep asking the patients to come back and keep revising our diagnosis, because what the future holds for us. And I'm very excited about the next 2 lectures, which I'm going to learn now. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I'm indebted to Dr. I.C. Verma, Dr. Ratnapuri, who have really shaped me into what I am. Thank you very much, and all the referring doctors. So I'll just stop sharing now.
Thank you, Sunita, for an excellent practical case-based approach to mitochondrial disorders. Not only did you highlight the varied inheritances which were particularly specific for children, but you brilliantly showed us through different cases the very clinical and metabolic features that are specific of, I would say, mitochondrial spectrum disorder today. We had to put a name to it. But I think the most important thing we have learned over the years is we realized, those of us practicing for many years, how we used to club everyone into mitochondrial disorders, and how with the advent of genetics, today we can actually give them a name, we can give them a specific gene, and how it has helped us in treatment, counseling, identification down the line. Thank you for an excellent talk.
Thank
we
you.
now go to the next speaker for today, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sonam Kothari, who is part of our team at the Wadia Children's Hospital. Sonam is instrumental in starting and is in charge of the mitochondrial lab at the Wadia Hospital. She dons numerous hats. Her new passion, in addition to mitochondrial and genetics, is ABA, and she has a lot of passion and interest in autism as well. In addition to numerous publications, she's also a member of numerous societies, particularly the Mitochondrial Society as well. And we now will have Sonam talk on pattern recognition in mitochondrial disease, a holistic approach. Over to you, Sonam.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Actually, I'm really privileged to talk on this platform with Dr. Rahman. Actually, when I was doing my work, I used to quote all her papers in my thesis. So really privileged. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Now I'll go directly to the topic. So while researching or for starting for the topic, I was thinking how to make it really simple and really interesting, that when you get a pattern of a particular disease, you know that this is a particular disease. So we'll go ahead and I'll go through the topic. So just to give a gist, already ma'am has told a lot about mitochondrial diseases. So mitochondrial, yeah.
Do you want to put it on slideshow, please?
Okay, yeah, so sorry. Yeah. So mitochondria is an energy producing subcellular organelle, as we all know. The basic function of mitochondria is giving energy with the help of the complexes, that is complex 1 to complex 5. Going to the complexity of mitochondria, each complex is made up of multiple subunits. Each subunit is coded by various genes. Going more for the complexity, the genetic control is dual. That is, it's coded by both mitochondrial as well as nuclear genes. Just to give you how important or how challenging it is to diagnose this disorder, previously it was known that they just present in syndromes, but in children there are hardly presenting syndromes which tell us that, yeah, if these symptoms are present, this syndrome is present, it's mitochondrial. Most of the children actually present with non-classic symptoms in pediatric age group. Pathology is very less sensitive in mitochondrial disorder diagnosis in the pediatric population. Biochemistry, very sensitive, definitely, but it gives a lot of false negatives. I'll go ahead how it shows the false negatives. And fourth one is the genetics, definitely important, very important in the diagnosis, but it gives a lot of novel variants, which definitely has to be proved by some or the other technique. So it poses a lot of diagnostic challenge, and a single diagnostic tool cannot diagnose mitochondrial disease. I tried to compile the result of all 7 studies to show that how difficult the diagnosis is. In these 7 studies, if you average, non-syndromic presentation was 58%. Pathology could give diagnosis only in 24% of patients. Biochemistry was positive in quite a lot of patients, but still, in our study in 2017, which it got published, 109 children were suspected. Only 85 could show deficiency according to the stringent criteria, that is less than 30% of the activity, which actually missed the remaining patients. Just to give a small introduction about the pathology and biochemistry, which was not covered by ma'am, just what all we see in pathology. This is an MGT strain, modified gomarite strain, where we look for ragged red fiber, as seen in the figure. These two are the COX SDH strain, basically these 3, which shows the partial COX deficiency. This is a COX deficient fiber, and this shows the complete COX deficiency, that is a complete deficient, all deficient fibers. Only SDH strain has been taken up. And the mitochondrial complex assays or the biochemistry, we basically do the assay or the analysis of each complex from the mitochondria, that is complex 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we see the activity of each activity seen in each patient using the spectrophotometer. And then the activity is calculated with the help of the Excel. Going more to the complexity, as we told, it's a dual control. Mitochondrial genes code for very few genes of the mitochondrial subunits, and most of the genes are actually coded by nuclear genes. Nuclear genes can be divided into structural genes and assembly genes. Assembly genes is basically the genes which join the two subunits of the same complex. Going further, there are other genes which actually code for the ferrous sulfur assembly genes, which are multiple in number, and they also can cause mitochondrial phenotype, disease phenotype. So basically, pattern recognition is so important for the comprehensive diagnostic approach for these disorders. So now going to the pattern recognition, first we'll go for the syndromic approach or syndromic diagnosis. I have tried to make it really pictorial so that it's easy for us to grasp it. So first we'll go for the Leigh syndrome. So as ma'am told, Leigh syndrome has a definite criteria given by Shamima ma'am in 1996 as progressive or episodic regression, neuroregression, with typical basal ganglia or brainstem involvement. As you can see, involvement of the central tegmental tract here, the substantia nigra, the periaqueductal gray matter, the globus pallidus, and the peridental white matter, dentate white matter. It can also just present with putaminal involvement, which can even show diffusion restriction with mild cerebellar atrophy. One important feature or one important pattern which you should recognize in Leigh syndrome is the pattern of SERF1 gene mutation. These children usually present with neuroregression at any age, starting from 1 year of age to even 5 years of age. And they have a typical MRI pattern involving the dentate nucleus, the inferior olivary nucleus, can involve the spinal cord, and the periaqueductal and the brainstem. Important clinical feature, they can present with hypertrichosis and even hypochromia or albinism or hypopigmentation with complete COX deficiency on pathology. So this is one pattern you should definitely consider with a child presenting with Leigh syndrome. So just to give you a gist, clinical criteria given for the Leigh syndrome. Imaging, it involves brainstem, basal ganglia, periaqueductal gray matter, centrotegmental tract, spinal cord, ION, and dentate nucleus. Complex assays, mostly complex 1 and 4 are deficient in Leigh syndrome. Sometimes they can present with multiple complex deficiency. Pathology, except for the SERF1 mutation, most of the pathology is negative. So it doesn't really help in diagnosis. Genetics, very few patients actually have mitochondrial gene mutation. So if the child presents at a later age, it can have a mitochondrial gene mutation, but mostly it's a nuclear gene coding for complex 4, complex 1 assembly genes or complex 1 structural genes. And salient feature, if you see a child presenting with a Leigh-like phenotype with hypertrichosis, hypochromia, and a typical neuroimaging, SERF1 should be suspected and immediately the genetics should be sent for SERF1 mutation. Now going to the second syndrome, that is MELAS. Ma'am already gave a clinical picture of MELAS. So this is a child, 11-year-old child suspected with MELAS, had multiple complex deficiency with a ragged red fiber and a partial COX deficiency on the histology. So MELAS present with multiple stroke-like episodes at different stages of which can be at different stages. One comes, the first one recovers or disappears, and the second one comes. Another boy with MELAS syndrome, whenever the child presents with a longer duration of illness, starting from 2-3 years of age, and the child you are seeing is at 11 or 10 years of age, you see that you might not see a proper stroke, but you can see some laminar necrosis and a cortical atrophy that has set in. You can see some salient features or subtle features like basal ganglia calcification. EEG can show epileptiform discharges anywhere and generalized or local. And the biopsy is very typical, showing ragged red fiber, COX deficiency, and even perivenular or venular COX deficiency. So going to the pattern recognition, so stroke-like episode before the age of 40 years of age, encephalopathy characterized by seizures, dementia, lactic acidosis, and definitely pathology helps because ragged red fibers or COX deficiency is definitely shown. MRI-wise, there is stroke-like lesions at different stages. Basal ganglia calcification and laminar necrosis are very typical of MELAS. Complex deficiency, usually they present with multiple complex deficiencies, sometimes complex 1 deficiency. Pathology is diagnostic, RRF, and with or without COX deficiency. And genetics, here we should, rather than going for a complete gene exome sequencing or nuclear genes, we should go for mitochondrial gene sequencing, and that to targeted because they are very specific, and the 3243 mutation on TRN and leucine is very specific for MELAS. And salient features are migraine-like headaches, short stature, or some kind of sensory hearing loss in the family with basal ganglia calcifications. Third common syndrome, which is Alpers syndrome. So Alpers syndrome can present in the juvenile period, in the neonatal period, in the infantile period, anytime. Going to the MRI picture, they can have just cortical atrophy, or they can have subtle cortical enhancements, cortical hyperintensities, as you can see in the picture. They can also have some subtle hyperintensities like in the thalamus, basal ganglia, or bilateral thalamus and basal ganglia. Important feature is EEG. The EEG shows usually something called as RADS, that is rhythmic delta activity, with posterior dominance with I don't know if you're able to see, but there are some kind of polyspikes which are superimposed. So those are called as RADS. So clinical feature, refractory seizures, hepatic dysfunction, and psychomotor delay. Imaging feature, cortical hyperintensities predominantly in the posterior region, thalamic hyperintensity, basal ganglia signal changes, cortical atrophy, symmetrical or asymmetrical. Second, complex assay, it is usually caused by Polg and the Polg related genes, which actually result in multiple deletions or depletion in the mitochondrial gene. So it causes multiple complex deficiency, or the most common one, that is the complex 1 deficiency. Pathology is usually negative in Alpers syndrome, so doesn't give you a clue. And salient features, valproate-induced toxicity, EEG showing RADS, these are the salient features of Alpers syndrome. Now comes the most interesting part, that is the non-syndromic part of the mitochondrial diseases, so which are actually difficult to diagnose. Now, the first non-syndromic is the leukoencephalopathy. Nowadays, everyone, whoever is practicing in pediatric neurology, they are seeing a lot of leukoencephalopathies coming, and they come out to be mitochondrial with time on genetic evaluation. So, just to give you a pattern that which kind of leukoencephalopathy gives rise to which kind of mitochondrial dysfunction. This is the first group of MRI images shows a 7-year-old boy presenting with a relapsing remitting illness like an MS phenotype, and had a multiple complex deficiency on the muscle biopsy. As you can see, the MRI shows multicystic changes, leukoencephalopathy, mainly involving the periventricular white matter, sparing the subcortical white matter, with small cysts, that is microcysts, can involve the spinal cord, and you can see the cyst clearly in the FLAIR imaging. So basically, this child had a multiple complex deficiency with the relapsing remitting illness, and had the mutation of IBA57, which is actually the gene responsible for ferrous sulfur assembly, which can cause multiple deficiency. Another picture is showing the same ferrous sulfur assembly mutation, that is NFU mutation, in a 7-month-old boy with neuroregression with multiple complex deficiency. Here also, if you can see the pattern, there is the periventricular white matter involvement, sparing the subcortical white matter, with small cysts, as you can see in here, giving a non-homogeneous pattern of the leukoencephalopathy. So microcystic involvement with a non-homogeneous look, and involving mainly the periventricular white matter, can present just with neuroregression or relapsing remitting illness. Going further, this is a child presenting with neuroregression with a complex 4 deficiency and a mutation in the COX-8 nuclear gene. So again, look at the pattern of the MRI. It shows again a microcystic lesion, a cyst-like picture, which is microcystic, involving mainly the periventricular white matter, the corpus callosum, along with diffusion restriction, as you can see in this patient. So the COX-4, a complex 4 deficiency with microcystic leukoencephalopathy. Interesting one is the complex 1 deficiency. Majority of the patients who present with complex 1 deficiency with a neuroregression and leukoencephalopathy picture will have a leukoencephalopathy again involving mainly the periventricular and a deep white matter, but they will have a macrocystic involvement. That is a complete vanishing kind of a picture if it is there, and or else they might not be having any cysts. And secondly, they are usually having this diffusion restriction, which is seen with the lactate peak. Going further, there are 2 more rare causes of leukoencephalopathy, which are the complex 2 deficiency and the complex 3 deficiency. So this is a 11-year-old girl who presented with neuroregression and had a complex 3 deficiency on a complex assay with a LYRM57 mutation. So this child again showed leukoencephalopathy, which actually went till the subcortical white matter, a dense leukoencephalopathy with some microcystic changes involving the peridentate white matter as well as the brainstem or the centrotegmental tract, and had a lactate peak. Going further, the complex 2 deficiency, it can also very rare, or only to a few cases have been reported with this gene causing leukoencephalopathy, but they definitely can cause. But the pattern or the difference in the pattern is it causes leukoencephalopathy involving the periventricular white matter, can involve the spinal cord and the brainstem, can have diffusion restriction, but usually doesn't have a cystic pattern. So going further, patterns of leukoencephalopathy. As we all know, this is a leukoencephalopathy with thalamic and the brainstem involvement with EARS2 mutation, that is a translational gene coded by the nuclear gene of mitochondria. So this pattern is involving the periventricular and the deep white matter involvement with the thalamic involvement, and the brainstem which is involved. Can be cystic, may not be cystic, can be both patterns can be seen. Spinal cord may be involved, may not be involved. So this is one typical pattern, and the pattern is seen in a EARS2 mutation, which is known as LTBL. Going further, the leukoencephalopathy with brainstem and spinal cord changes, signal changes with lactic acidosis. They are seen in DARS2 mutation or DARS2 mutation, which is nuclear coded tRNA translational gene, tRNA synthetase gene. The pattern, again, as the name suggests, it's leukoencephalopathy, which involves the periventricular and the deep white matter, maybe or may not be cystic, can involve the internal capsule, spinal cord, the tractal involvement, very typical, tractal involvement of the white matter, and the dense spinal cord involvement, which can be seen. Interesting part is this disease, when present in a neonatal period or in the very early infantile period, the typical changes are not of LSBL or LBSL are not seen. They just have some atrophy, which is a dense atrophy of the cerebral matter with if you can see, there are tortuosity of the vessels which can be seen, which actually after 6 months, if you repeat the MRI, this tortuosity goes off. So tortuosity of vessels with cortical atrophy with subtle signal changes may be seen in the medulla or 1 or 2 regions. But they are not seen, the typical picture is not seen till 6 months of age, 6 or 8 months of age. So even if a child, when you suspect a mitochondrial disease, in the neonatal period, you do an MRI picture is like this, do suspect a LBSL variant and send for the nuclear gene mutation. So just going to the complete pattern recognition, what I could get is clinically neuroregression They can present with neuroregression, usually following a fever. Many times they present with relapsing remitting neurological illness, which mimic very much like the MS or the NMO phenotype. They are very slowly progressive, and mostly they have a better prognosis. They don't actually deteriorate with time, but rather improve with time or have a relapsing remitting course. Imaging wise, they can be macro or microcystic. They can have diffusion restriction. They can involve any from the white matter, the brainstem, and to the spinal cord. Complex assays, usually it's complex 1 or complex 4 deficiency. Rarely you can see 2 or 3 deficiency. Pathology wise, they are positive with RRF or this thing only if it they are positive only if there is a complex 4 deficiency. And usually it's a structural or assembly gene of complex 1 and 4, which are nuclear coded, and tRNA synthetase again nuclear coded. Not mitochondrial sequencing doesn't doing in this type of phenotype. If you have a microcystopathy, look for complex 4, 3, and rarely complex 2 deficiency. If it's a macrocystic with contrast enhancement and diffusion restriction, look for complex 1 genes. Thalami, brainstem, and spinal cord involvement, look for tRNA synthetase mutation. Usually these kids respond to steroids, so steroidal management should be given to these kids because they actually respond like the MS patients. The final or the non-syndromic one, which are really common, but we really miss it because there is no pattern followed, are the Polgy and the Polgy-related disorders. Important clinical clues which you should look for is sensory ataxic neuropathy. If a patient you are suspecting having a sensory ataxic neuropathy, cerebellar involvement, ophthalmoplegia, muscle weakness, and along with this 1 or 2 features, you are having cognitive impairment and psychiatric illness, you should definitely look for Polgy-related disorder. Sensory ataxic neuropathy, really specific, very much sensitive for mitochondrial disorders. So the syndromes which can be associated with Polgy-related disorders are ataxia neuropathy syndromes, myopathy, CPEO plus syndrome, epileptic encephalopathies, progressive myoclonic epilepsy or progressive myoclonic encephalopathy, childhood onset extrapyramidal syndrome, and with striatal necrosis. So these are the first I told are usually the clinical symptoms or symptomatology. The syndromes they fit in are these one, that is the ataxia neuropathy syndrome, myopathy, and so on. Now going to the MRI. MRI is basically normal in 35% of patients. So most of them can have a normal MRI. And very non-specific MRI like cerebellar atrophy and cerebellar hyperintensities can be seen in few. Pathology positive is only in myopathy, CPO, and PME phenotypes sometimes. Otherwise, usually other phenotypes are negative. So query clue, if you are having a myopathy, CPO, or PME phenotype, you can go for the pathology diagnostic, but otherwise it is negative. Complex deficiency, because it is caused by Polgy-related disorders, it causes multiple deletions or depletion in the mitochondrial genome. So it causes multiple complex deficiency. And mutations, as we all know, it's a replication genes, Polgy1, Polgy2, Twinkle, Sagla, and so on. One important feature we actually observed in our study is these Polgy-related disorders, they usually present at a later age. That means they start usually from 5 years, 3 years, 6 years, 4 years of age. So and it's a very slowly progressive disease. So they survive also for a very long time. So what we saw was there was an early mineralization in these children, which is actually seen with aging. So this is an MRI of a just 9-year-old boy, which actually shows a significant mineralization in the globus pallidus, substantia nigra, even the dentate nucleus, if you can see. Even the red nucleus here, you can see the mineralization. So maybe the pathology might be early aging due to the mitochondrial dysfunction, which is one of the pathology described in mitochondrial disorders, which causes early mineralization. So actually the other syndromes or other like NARP, MRF or anything, they don't really have a mitochondrial, they don't have a pattern recognition, so I didn't take them there. After we did the study, I came up with a small diagnostic algorithm which will help you in going for the diagnosis, how to go about. So first is clinically suspected mitochondrial disease after confirming with MRI, confirming with MRI and other evaluations. So you can see that you can divide them into syndromic and non-syndromic group. Syndromic group, if you are suspecting Leigh syndrome with brainstem involvement and hypertrichosis, directly send for SERF1 mutation. If you are suspecting MELAS, it rather than sending for a nuclear gene or any NGS, look for targeted 3243 mutation or MTTR mutation. Third one is Alpers syndrome. If you're suspecting Alpers syndrome, go directly for the NGS for the nuclear genes, that is Twinkle, Golgi, and so on. And if you're suspecting CPO, KSS, or myopathy-like phenotype, it's better to go for biopsy first. If everything is negative, then definitely you have to go for biopsy. Muscle biopsy can be divided, histology and biochemically. Histology positive, histology negative. Histology positive, they can just have COX deficiency with isolated complex 4 deficiency on biochemistry. If the phenotypes fit in Leigh syndrome or leukoencephalopathy, directly go for nuclear complex 4 gene screening. If there is ragged red fiber with complex COX deficiency, with the complex 1 or multiple complex deficiency, and the phenotype fits in ANS or ataxia neuropathy syndrome or Polg related phenotype or myopathy or CPO, ideally you should go for deletion and depletion screening, which is really important because even if you get Polg or Polg related gene mutation, ideally the proof is that it is secondarily causing the deletion or depletion in the mitochondrial gene. If that is not there, it doesn't cause the disease. So you should ideally go for muscle biopsy deletion depletion screening and then go for the NGS for the nuclear gene for screening this Polg related disorders. If it is histologically negative, then it can be either isolated complex deficiencies with a normal histology or it can be multiple complex deficiency with normal histology. If it's isolated complex deficiency with these particular phenotypes, directly go for nuclear complex gene. Mitochondrial genes usually in the study what we did not give us much clue in the histologically negative patients. Multiple complex deficiency with these phenotypes like leukoencephalopathy, you should look for tRNA synthetase genes, and Polg related phenotypes like ANS, myopathy, CPO, you should actually go for replication genes or Polg related disorders. And so this was a targeted approach. If nothing works out, you can go for the complete exome sequencing. So I actually end my talk here. But the important message is that after doing the biopsy, just doing a gene sequencing or just doing an NGS actually doesn't prove that really that is causing the disease or not. You actually have to functionally prove it by either doing a biochemical assay or proving the deletion or depletion in the muscle biopsy or just prove somehow that, or by pathology, that it is actually causing the disease. So I end my talk here. Thank you so much. If any questions, I can take it, if time is there. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Sonam, for finishing on time and for the excellent talk on pattern recognition in mitochondrial disorders with the detailed description of the neuroimaging. And I'm sure a lot of people will have questions for Dr. Sonam, and which you can all post in the chat box. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I now have the I now have the privilege of introducing our next speaker for the day, the much awaited talk of the day by Professor Dr. Shamima Rahman, who's a doyen in pediatric metabolic disorders, specifically mitochondrial disorders. She's currently the professor of pediatric metabolic medicine at UCL at the Genetics and Genomic Medicine Department, UCL. Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health, London. She is the training advisor and also a founding member of the SSIEM. And she has done most of her training in London. She is the editor of the most sacred Journal of Inherited Metabolic Diseases and the senior editor of the Annals of Human Genetics. She is a scientific advisory board to several
Sorry, Maya, we couldn't hear the second half of your.
oh, sorry.
To start, thank you so much for the very kind invitation and the introduction. I'd like to particularly thank Dr. Anne Agnes Matthew for this invitation, and she was a fantastic colleague when she was a Great.
In all aspects. And before we close, we would like to just highlight the next session, which is on the 22nd of May, which is on white matter disorders. And we have Dr. Rekha Cherian, Dr. Nicole Wolf, and Dr. Kish Mankad, who will be covering all the aspects of white matter disorders. So look forward to seeing you all next Saturday at 6 o'clock again. Thank you. Anne, is there anything more we need to?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And a great big thanks to all the speakers, as well as to the very dynamic moderating team. Thank you, Dr. Maya and Dr. Anita. Thank you so much. And ORDI.
Thank you for the great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.